You're 24 years old. You just bought a $180 jacket using Klarna. 4 payments of $45. Easy. No interest. You can handle $45, except you've also got 3 other buy now, pay later payments running. There's the $400 in AirPods you're paying off through Affirm, the $250 standing desk from Afterpay, and last week you split a $90 dinner with friends using Klarna again because your checking account was low. You check your calendar, you've got $127 in BNPL payments due this week, another $94 next week, and you just realized you forgot about the $65 payment that was supposed to come out yesterday. Your credit card is maxed at $2,800. Your checking account has $340 in it. Your next paycheck is in 9 days, and you're starting to panic because you genuinely don't remember how you got here. If that sounds familiar or even close to familiar, you're making the same mistake millions of Gen Zers are making right now, and it's not what you think. All right, let's start with the scale of this thing because most people have no idea how big buy now, pay later has gotten. According to Capital One Shopping's research, the U.S. BNPL purchase volume hit $122.3 billion in 2025. That's up 10.9% year over year. For context, that's about 1.1% of total credit card spending in the same year. But here's where it gets interesting. It's not spread evenly across generations. 44% of Gen Z used buy now, pay later services in 2025. That's the equivalent of around 30 million young people. According to eMarketer projections, approximately 50.7% of Gen Z digital buyers will use BNPL in 2025. That's majority adoption for a single generation. By comparison, Gen X is at 28% usage, and baby boomers are at 13%. And Gen Z isn't just using it occasionally. According to Motley Fool Money's 2025 Buy Now, Pay Later Trends survey, more than half of Gen Z, 51%, say they use BNPL more often than credit cards. Read that again, more often than credit cards. Now, here's where we need to talk about psychology, because BNPL is designed to feel fundamentally different from debt. When you put $500 on a credit card, your brain registers that as borrowing money. You know you owe $500, you know there's interest if you don't pay it off. The psychological weight is there. But when you split that same $500 into 4 payments of $125, your brain doesn't process it the same way. It's not $500 of debt, it's just $125, which feels manageable, which feels like not debt. According to surveys, 53% of BNPL users say they trust these services more than credit card companies. They genuinely believe BNPL is safer, smarter, less risky. And technically, they're right, if you're using it for one purchase at a time and paying it off. But that's not what's happening. According to LendingTree's research, nearly 1 in 4 BNPL users, 23%, say they've had 3 or more active BNPL loans at the same time. And 16% of Gen Z users have used BNPL 6 or more times. You're not using it for one jacket. You're using it for everything. And that's when it stops being a tool and starts being a trap. According to Experian's 2025 consumer debt data, the average Gen Z consumer, ages 18 to 29, carries approximately $3,493 in credit card debt. Now you might think, that's not that bad compared to other generations. Gen X averages $9,600 in credit card debt. So Gen Z is doing better, right? Wrong, because that $3,493 average has risen roughly 30% in just 3 years. Gen Z is accumulating credit card debt at a faster rate than millennials did at the same age. And here's what's worse, that $3,493 doesn't include BNPL debt, because most BNPL providers don't report to credit bureaus. The Richmond Fed calls this phantom debt. BNPL liability is invisible to other lenders. You can be carrying $2,000 in BNPL obligations across 4 different platforms, and your credit report shows 0 of it. So when we say the average Gen Z consumer has $3,493 in credit card debt, the real number, including BNPL, is higher. We just don't know how much higher because nobody's tracking it systematically. Now, here's where the BNPL story gets really ugly. Late payments. According to LendingTree's 2026 BNPL tracker, 41% of BNPL users say they paid late on one of these loans in the past year. That's up from 34% just a year ago. According to Federal Reserve data, the share of BNPL users making late payments is rising, and the consequences are real. While BNPL providers don't always report on-time payments to credit bureaus, they're increasingly reporting late payments and sending accounts to collections. So you get none of the credit-building benefits when you pay on time, but you get all of the credit-destroying penalties when you're late. Asymmetric risk. And here's what's particularly damaging. According to the Motley Fool survey, 26% of BNPL users say they've regretted using it once the full cost hit home. For millennials and Gen Z specifically, that number is even higher, 30% and 27% respectively. 1 in 4 people who use these services end up regretting it. That's not a fringe problem. That's a systemic issue with how the product works. Most BNPL platforms advertise pay in 4, interest-free. And technically, that's true. If you split a $200 purchase into 4 payments of $50 every 2 weeks, you pay exactly $200, no interest. But here's what they don't tell you. The behavior change costs way more than interest ever would. According to the Motley Fool data, more than half of BNPL users, 56%, say they've used it to make purchases they otherwise couldn't afford. Let that sink in. Not purchases they were saving up for, purchases they couldn't afford. And here's the mechanism. When you see a $600 item, your brain might say, I can't afford that. But when you see 4 payments of $150, your brain goes, oh, $150 is manageable. Except you're not comparing $150 to your budget. You're comparing $150 to $600. And $150 sounds reasonable compared to $600. This is called framing bias, and it's the entire business model. Make the payment seem small compared to the purchase price, and people spend more. According to Consumer Financial Protection Bureau data from their 2025 study, Americans who use BNPL services typically have higher balances on other unsecured credit types. On average, BNPL users carry $453 more in personal loans and $871 more in credit card debt compared to non-BNPL users. BNPL doesn't replace other debt. It adds to it. People are using BNPL for groceries. According to LendingTree's research, 25% of BNPL users say they've used these loans to buy groceries in 2025. That's up from 14% just 1 year earlier. 1/3 of Gen Z BNPL users report having done this. Groceries are the 4th most common BNPL purchase for Gen Z, trailing only clothing, technology, and home decor. Let me be very clear about what this means. If you're using buy now, pay later to pay for food, you are living beyond your means. Full stop. Groceries are a recurring expense. If you can't afford this week's groceries with this week's paycheck, splitting it into 4 payments doesn't solve the problem, it just delays it by 2 weeks. And in 2 weeks, you'll need groceries again, except now you also have last week's payment due. This is the debt spiral. You use BNPL to cover a gap, but the gap is still there next cycle, so you use BNPL again and again. And each time you're adding another layer of obligations. According to research, 22% of BNPL users also use the service to pay for food delivery in 2025. You're not just splitting groceries into payments, you're splitting DoorDash orders. That $40 Thai food delivery, you're paying it off over 6 weeks. Okay, so let's talk about what happens when you're juggling multiple BNPL loans simultaneously. According to the Motley Fool survey, just 47% of BNPL users plan their payments ahead of time. Most either track loosely or lose track altogether. Gen Z is the least likely to plan, only 38% budget before buying. Baby boomers, for comparison, are at 62%. They're the only generation where a majority actually plans these purchases. What this means in practice: you take out a BNPL loan, you're good for the first payment because it's immediate. Second payment comes out 2 weeks later, you're still kind of tracking it. But by the 3rd and 4th payment, you've forgotten it exists. And when you've got 3 or 4 BNPL loans running simultaneously, forget it, you have no idea what's coming out when. According to the data, 32% of BNPL users have run into a problem with their service. The most common issues are returning items, 21%, getting refunds, 18%, and losing track of payment dates, 19%. Losing track of payment dates is the 3rd most common problem. That's not user error. That's a feature of how the system works. When you're juggling multiple loans from different providers with different payment schedules, you're going to lose track. Now let's talk about credit scores because there's a massive misconception here. According to Empower Research, 40% of BNPL users say the loans not impacting their credit is a top benefit. They think this is a good thing. But here's the reality. Most BNPL providers don't report on-time payments to credit bureaus. So when you successfully pay off a BNPL loan, your credit score doesn't improve. You get zero credit building benefit. But, and this is critical, they increasingly do report late payments and collections. So when you screw up, it hurts you. When you succeed, it doesn't help you. This is the opposite of how credit cards work. With a credit card, on-time payments build your credit history. With BNPL, on-time payments do nothing, but late payments destroy your score. And here's what makes this particularly damaging for Gen Z. According to Experian data, Gen Z's average FICO score is 680. That's not terrible, but it's not great either. And 48% of Gen Z have subprime or no credit scores at all, so Gen Z needs to be building credit. They need positive payment history, and they're choosing a payment method that gives them zero credit building benefit when they pay on time. According to a U.S. news survey from 2026, 43% of respondents believe that using their debit card allows them to establish credit. They don't understand how credit works. And now they're using BNPL, which also doesn't build credit, thinking they're being financially responsible. All right, so let me explain what's actually happening here because this isn't really about BNPL. BNPL is just the mechanism. The real issue is behavior. Gen Z is normalizing installment debt for small purchases. You're treating a $180 jacket the same way previous generations treated a $10,000 car. According to research from the debt relief company, BNPL creates spending habits that carry over into credit card usage. When you've been splitting $90 dinners into payments since you were 18, the psychological barrier to carrying a balance is lower. You're not learning to save up for things. You're learning to split everything into payments. And that pattern, once established, is incredibly hard to break. Here's the timeline. You start using BNPL at 18 or 19 for small purchases. Clothing, tech accessories, maybe some furniture for your first apartment. It feels manageable. 4 payments of $50? No problem. By 22, you're using it for everything. Groceries, food delivery, everyday purchases. You've got multiple loans running simultaneously, and you're starting to lose track. By 24, you've maxed out a credit card trying to cover BNPL payments when your checking account runs low. Now you're in credit card debt and BNPL debt. And here's the worst part. According to research, a 22-year-old who begins carrying a credit card balance has potentially 40-plus years of compounding interest ahead of them if the pattern isn't interrupted early. You're establishing a pattern in your early 20s that could cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars over your lifetime. Now let's talk about what Gen Z isn't doing while they're racking up BNPL and credit card debt. Saving. According to Bank of America's 2025 Better Money Habits study, 55% of Gen Z do not have enough emergency savings to cover 3 months of expenses. That number has been basically flat since 2022. For context, financial advisors recommend 3 to 6 months of expenses in an emergency fund. More than half of Gen Z doesn't have 3 months, and the number isn't improving. Meanwhile, according to the same study, 72% of Gen Z took steps to improve their financial health over the last year, including 51% who put money toward savings. So Gen Z knows they should be saving. They're trying to save. But they're still not building adequate emergency funds. Why? Because they're funneling money toward BNPL payments and credit card debt instead of savings. You can't save when you're drowning in payment obligations. Now here's where we need to talk about income. Because there's a fundamental mismatch happening. According to YouGov Profiles data from 2025, 35% of Gen Z say their income allows them to save a little each month. 22% say they cover their expenses but cannot save. And 23% report falling short of covering their expenses. So nearly half of Gen Z, 45%, either can't save or can't cover expenses. They're living paycheck to paycheck or worse. And yet, according to Bank of America's research, 47% of Gen Z receive some form of financial support from family. That's down from 54% in 2024, and the amounts are declining. In 2024, 32% received $1,000 or more. In 2025, only 22% receive $1,000 or more. Parental support is declining. Income isn't keeping up with expenses. And Gen Z is using BNPL and credit cards to bridge the gap. This is unsustainable. You cannot borrow your way out of an income problem. Here's something that needs to be said. Gen Z has the lowest financial literacy rate of any generation. According to the TIAA Institute GFLEC Personal Finance Index from 2025, Gen Z has a financial literacy rate of 38%. Baby boomers and the silent generation are at 55%. Gen Z scores lowest on questions about compound interest, inflation, and the time value of money. The exact concepts you need to understand to make smart decisions about debt. And yet, Gen Z shows a stronger interest in personal finance education. According to Ramsey Solutions data, 35% of Gen Z are enrolled in personal finance courses, compared to 24% for millennials and only 10% for baby boomers. So Gen Z wants to learn. They're seeking out education. But the baseline knowledge just isn't there yet. And in the meantime, BNPL companies are targeting them with aggressive marketing, simple approval processes, and messaging that makes debt feel like smart money management. Let me show you the actual cost of using BNPL regularly, because the interest-free label hides the real price. Let's say you're a typical Gen Z BNPL user. You use it 3 times per month, once for clothing, $150, once for tech or home goods, $200, once for miscellaneous, $80. That's $430 per month in BNPL purchases. Over a year, that's $5,160 in purchases made via BNPL that you wouldn't have made if you'd had to pay in full upfront. We know this because 56% of users admit they use BNPL for purchases they can't afford. Now that $5,160 isn't going on a credit card earning 2% cash back. It's not being paid from a checking account you already had the money for. You're spending money you don't have using a payment structure that makes it feel affordable. The opportunity cost? If you had that $430 per month to actually spend and you instead invested it in a low-cost index fund earning 8% annually, in 10 years you'd have $78,421. In 30 years, you'd have $596,385. That's what the interest-free installment plans are actually costing you, not the interest you're not paying, the wealth you're not building because you're spending money you don't have on stuff you wouldn't buy if you had to pay up front. All right, so what's the actual solution here? Because I'm not just here to tell you BNPL is bad. I'm here to tell you what works instead. First, if you currently have active BNPL loans, list them all, every single one. Write down the provider, the amount owed, the payment schedule. Get it all in one place where you can see it. According to the data, 19% of users lose track of payment dates. Don't be that person. You cannot manage debt you're not tracking. Second, stop using BNPL immediately, not after this one last purchase. Now, the behavior pattern is the problem. Using it just for emergencies or just for things I need is how you end up with 3 active loans and a maxed credit card. Third, build a micro emergency fund of $500 to $1,000 before you do anything else. According to Bankrate's research, most Americans can't cover a $400 emergency without borrowing. That's why they use BNPL. Break that cycle. Set up automatic transfers, even if it's just $25 per paycheck. Build the fund before the next emergency hits. Fourth, get a secured credit card with a $300 to $500 limit if you don't already have a credit card. Use it for one recurring expense, Netflix, a Spotify, whatever. Pay it off in full every month. This actually builds credit. BNPL doesn't. Fifth, understand this. You cannot spend your way to financial security using installment plans. The math doesn't work. If you can't afford it in one payment, you can't afford it in 4 payments. You're just delaying the problem. So what's the biggest money mistake Gen Z is making right now? It's not student loans. Gen Z is taking out way less student debt than millennials did. Only 21% want student loans, according to Bank of America. It's not crypto or meme stocks. Those are mistakes, but they're not the systemic issue. The biggest mistake is normalizing debt for everyday purchases through buy now, pay later. You're using installment loans to buy groceries, takeout, and clothing. You're splitting $90 dinners into 4 payments. You're carrying 3 or 4 active BNPL loans simultaneously and losing track of payment dates. And you think this is fine because it's interest-free and doesn't hurt your credit. But it does hurt you, just not in ways that show up on a credit report. It hurts you by establishing a spending pattern where you never save up for anything. It hurts you by making you dependent on credit to cover basic expenses. It hurts you by preventing you from building an emergency fund because you're always making payments on something. According to the data, 84% of credit-active Gen Z consumers had at least one credit card as of late 2023. That's significantly higher than the 61% of millennials who held a card at the same age a decade earlier. You're accumulating debt faster than any generation before you, and you're doing it for smaller purchases, which means you're learning to be comfortable with debt for things that previous generations would have just saved up for or gone without. The correction here isn't complicated, it's just hard. Stop using BNPL. Build an emergency fund. Live within your actual income. Use credit cards strategically to build credit, not to finance a lifestyle you can't afford. The math is simple. If you're 24 and you break the BNPL habit now, invest the money you would have spent on payments, you'll have hundreds of thousands of dollars more by the time you're 54. If you don't break the habit, you'll be 54, still making payments on stuff you bought in your 20s with nothing saved, wondering where it all went wrong. The choice is yours. But the data is pretty clear about which path most people are currently on.